Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this panel hosted by the New Republic, the Crusade Against Trans Rights. We have an incredible lineup of panelists here, which I'm going to introduce them very shortly, but just a little bit of housekeeping. This panel will be available later on YouTube if you want to watch it and share it with other people. And we're also going to do a Q&A at the end. So if you want to leave any questions for us, I will take a look at those when we are getting to about 15 minutes before the end. So with that, I want to just boast about this incredible group of people. We have with us Rachel Gonzales, Remington Johnson, and Adri Perez. Rachel is an advocate and ally in the movement for trans equality. As a mother of a transgender child, she fights to ensure that other parents are able to advocate for their transgender children. Rachel has testified many times at the Texas Capitol, which is where we met, and she's been an integral part of blocking Texas's many proposed anti-transgender bills since 2017. She's also a member of the Human Rights Campaign National Parents for Transgender Equality Council, and she's participated in roundtable discussions with the Congressional Transgender Equality Task Force in Washington. A fourth-generation native Texan, Rachel is based in Texas, where she lives with her husband, 3 children, and 3 dogs. Next, we have the Reverend Remington Olivia Johnson, a Presbyterian clergywoman, mother, and trans woman who's worked at the bedside of the sick and dying as healthcare chaplain for many years. She'll soon begin working as an ICU nurse in Austin, Texas, where she lives with her partner and child. Remington shows up over and over with organizations, families, and the trans community to protect, defend, and care for trans children. Her efforts to care for her community have been detailed in local, state, national, and international news outlets. And last, we have Adri Perez, a lifelong El Pasoan, UTEP graduate, policy and advocacy strategist for the ACLU of Texas, where they lead LGBTQIA+ advocacy on the sexuality and gender equality team. Adri represents the ACLU of Texas in statewide coalitions, trains and educates families of trans kids, and advocates at the legislature on bills that affect trans Texans. Before joining the ACLU of Texas in 2018, Adri started West Fund, the first abortion fund in West Texas. And they also co-founded the Frontierex Fianza Fund that raises money to pay bonds for people in immigration detention. And Audrey is based in El Paso and Austin. So this panel is, if you have been following coverage of the Crusade Against Trans Rights and the New Republic, these are all folks that I have now been in touch with for about a year. And the last year has been completely wild, horrifying, stressful, unprecedented when it comes to the amount of attention that the Republican Party, for the large part, has been able to focus on trans kids. This isn't entirely new. You'll hear from some folks tonight talking about how this is a fight they've been in for years, but there's something very different about what's been going on in the last year. And so that's sort of how we're going to talk about Texas tonight. Texas, for the last year, I think, has given us a sense of what is going to, and in some states is already happening. And there's, I think, a lot of lessons learned from folks there. And it's also, to be cognizant of that, like really tough and still happening. So this is a very uncertain moment also that we are speaking from. I just want to, before we dig in, I wonder if each of you could speak a little bit to the landscape of what you're seeing, maybe have seen over the last year. And, some of the things I'm thinking about are the ways that this campaign against trans kids has really meant to exhaust people, to grind them down, and to take trans kids and put them up for public debate, and to take advantage of the ways that people may or may not know trans folks already and sort of distort that debate, distort their knowledge. And anybody can jump in and start.
Oh, I mean, that's a big question, Melissa. It's a big question. The answer is both short and long. The short version is that the Republicans' effort to make the life of the transgender American harder has worked. They have created an atmosphere of discomfort and terror, both for the children, their families that love and care for them, and for the community at large. So that has succeeded. Whether things get held up in the courts or it's just talk, or folks see it as sort of political efforts. there are very real consequences to these children and their families and the larger community. And so I think, what we see is that none of this is new. It is concerted efforts by, Christian nationalistic organizations, Christian fundamentalist organizations, along with just sort of craven ploys for political power. And you mix all that together and you get this unholy group working to maintain and consolidate power, specifically in Texas, right? You see this with Governor Abbott, you see it with Ken Paxton, where they're building their coalition, by threatening and harming the children of this state. I mean, that's how they are holding on to power. I mean, not only is it's just bad, bad governing, but it's deeply unethical and sort of harms all of us. So yeah, the simple version of this is it feels bad. The complex piece is a lot of money has gone into this for a lot of years at really, really big levels for people who are pulling the strings. And what we're seeing the sort of the rotten fruits of their efforts that are springing up all over the place and making life harder, not only for the children, for their families, and also for the adults.
I could talk forever, but I mean, Remington, thank you for that beautiful intro to what's happening and very comprehensive way of putting it. What we're seeing is an unprecedented attack on transgender existence and identities in this moment in state legislatures, on school boards, in libraries and classrooms, overall in our ability to exist at this point, just in being able to access life-saving medically necessary care, not just for adolescents and teens, but also now for adults in some states. So we're seeing those attacks starting to be waged against transgender people. And so we have to ask ourselves why, and they are doing it to maintain hold of the power during a time that they feel that they are losing it. And this is a political issue that gets people riled up because transgender people are unfamiliar to so much of the American population. And whenever there is a gap in something that humans do not understand, in the same way when we did not understand COVID, an opportunity presents itself to be filled with this misinformation, with lies, and people become extremely susceptible to falling into those traps. But those aren't the people who are controlling this fight, right? Those are just the people that are going to vote for the candidates that are fueling these issues, because they are being paid by Christian fundamentalist organizations that are trying to use this as a way to maintain power. And I think it's on all of us to really start to paint this as an issue that is going eventually to impact not just transgender people, but whatever group of the most vulnerable people comes next, right? Because whenever we are, as a society, are attacking the most vulnerable, making them feel more ostracized and isolated from belonging or from existing, that is a very dangerous precedent to set as a society. And it is not going to end at transgender people. It is going to be whatever comes next that does not fit an extremely limited Christian fundamentalist view. And transgender people, quite frankly, we exist. We have been here for a long time. And to try to sell this as something that is unnatural or something that undesirable in our society is egregious. And I think that we should all be promoting a society where we can all exist, but the right to swing our fists ends at the tip of another man's nose.
I distinctly remember a moment in March of last year when I was listening to the beginnings of I think it was the sports ban debate, the very first one, because there was a bunch. And I had gone to pick up tacos and I was waiting for them, sitting outside, and I was listening to it in my earbuds because I'm always listening to the hearings. And sorry, the dogs say hi. And I just started crying because we had spent, I started my advocacy in 2016, really preparing for the 2017 bathroom bill battle. And it was really focused on kind of baseline education and really giving families the resources that they need to be able to support their trans kids, because there's so many cis het families like mine that had a lot to learn. And so there was so much effort going into giving families the resources that they need, educators, and then sitting down and listening to the insane number of lies that Republicans were willing to blurt out just 5 seconds was undoing all of these years of work. And it was all fabricated. It was all lies to feed their political agenda. It was all political theater. And it's at the expense of my child, the expense of our most vulnerable kids in this state. And it was just so overwhelming to sit there and go, oh my God, we've been doing all this work. And now what? Now we have this huge wave coming over us. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. That was the very beginning of this insane year we had last year, where 52 of the 78 anti-LGBTQ bills were specifically targeting trans youth. And I think most people don't even realize that. I mean, even Democrats running for office in Texas right now still don't even seem to realize that. And it is such an overwhelming place to be when you're trying with everything you have to fight for your kid and other kids like her. And people don't even recognize what's happening to them because the Republicans are so successfully filling this gap of knowledge with blatant lies, and people are believing them.
I think that's the number that you lifted up of the bills reminded me of how hard it was even following this to keep up with what was going on. Texas last year, and correct me if I'm wrong, there were 3 special legislative sessions that followed the regular session. So it just went on and on and on. And when I was in Austin, it was the end of the first session. And even though all of the anti-trans bills that had been introduced to that point were defeated, nobody felt good about this at all. It didn't feel like a victory because it was clear that there was more coming. And it was also clear that these bills had created an environment where like it was just open season on trans people. And I think that was something very hard to try to convey to people. And I tried in my reporting to make sense of that for people, that like, it's not about how many bills pass. It's about creating this sort of chaos and permission giving for people to target the trans community. That is the net effect of this, even when it looks like political theater. And there is a lot of theatrics to it with the misinformation and kind of creating these tropes about trans kids that now we're seeing in the groomer discourse. But it has real impact on people's lives. I want to ask a little bit about that chaotic kind of part of it first, because we have this wave of bills, which we were just talking about. But then I think the thing that really tipped what was going on in Texas over into a major national concern was when Ken Paxton and Greg Abbott, not through changing any laws, but by simply interpreting what they believed the state law in Texas said about gender affirming care for trans kids and those who support them in that care, and potentially defining those who support them as committing acts of child abuse. And this was a law that they couldn't get passed, and yet it is an action that they tried to take simply by issuing a letter and creating just a huge political firestorm, to the extent that Abbott credited this as something that helped him in the election that shortly followed, or the primary election that shortly followed. So I'm wondering if one or all of you could speak to this, like how is this sort of like going outside the law even to do this, creating problems, sort of explaining to people what's going on? I remember in those early days, and maybe you can speak to this, Rachel, just even figuring out was this legal? Was this going to happen? Was this going to harm people? And Adri can speak to that too. Like, how do we even interpret these actions, which largely seem to be about, getting on Fox News and playing to the base? They're not thoughtful policy making. We've left that long ago. This is, propaganda.
Adri, you want to go first?
No, please.
I mean, we did, Adri and I worked on organizing a Zoom to get people educated as quickly as possible, because parents were freaking out, me included, And we were all assured that none of this was legal. And then CPS started visiting families anyway. And that's when we really all went into panic mode. It's absolutely terrifying because our governor and attorney general are they're attempting to change the law illegally or giving directives illegally. And I'm not an attorney, obviously. But mandatory reporters don't understand, by and large, that this is just an opinion piece. This does not change the law. And we keep hearing stories of parents still now where teachers or other mandatory reporters are just reporting families for having a trans kid because they feel like they will be criminalized if they don't, as the governor's directive said. So, right now we're all, I guess, in a little bit of a holding pattern, waiting to see what the Texas Supreme Court decides if they say anything. But it's pretty terrifying. It's really, really horrific for all of my children, not just my trans daughter, to think about our family being torn apart.
I read a piece today in Vanity Fair specifically that was referring to a new right movement that referred to themselves as trying to uphold their own family values and morals and their own right to raise a family, which is said in air quotes and parentheses for what they mean, right, which is like cis heteronormative, like patriarchal white supremacist family, and what has been indoctrinated of us for a long time as a queer person, and I will use that word just to flip that language on its head. And they were referring to using tactics that were super constitutional. And I found it interesting to read that in text, because in Texas, we've seen laws like SB 8, which subvert the judicial system entirely. And now we're seeing this rise of vigilantism in the same way, with this order from the governor and the opinion from the attorney general, right? It invokes a kind of vigilantism that would call on social workers, counselors, teachers, medical professionals to report the children of the trans children who have supportive parents to CPS, and weaponize a system that should be for child welfare against families that are actually loving and supportive and just doing what is best for their kids by providing life-saving, medically necessary care, right? And so the functional effect of this, even though they didn't pass a new law, they didn't pass a new policy, has been that families have been investigated. It is a continued attack on transgender people in the state of Texas and across the country. And now we're seeing a similar attack in the state of Florida, right? And another one in Missouri, and one in Alabama and Arkansas. And it goes on and on and on. And I don't think that we're going to see an end soon, but we need to be smart about what's happening, right? And it is very intentional and well-funded. And the functional effect of this, even though they didn't pass a law, has been that hospitals canceled appointments, has been that doctors themselves have canceled, individual providers have canceled appointments and refused to see patients. Clinics that used to do testosterone shots for their patients have stopped doing that, and now will only prescribe hormones to adults as well, if they can self-inject themselves. Their care has been detrimentally affected already, even though there is a statewide injunction in place from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And the state has still tried to appeal it to the Texas Supreme Court. And while there has been silence for over 4 weeks now, and the Supreme Court, to be clear, can be silent forever, the injunction remains in place, and care is still being affected. And that needs to be acknowledged and named, and it will continue to be a liability risk for insurance companies to the doctors who provide this care for as long as the government is attacking
it. Can I jump in on this too? So y'all guys crushed it with your responses, and I think there's something else here which I think is interesting, right? I mean, all of this is horrible, right? It's terrible. It feels bad. It's providers are pulling services, families are feeling terrified. I mean, no one is going to come out of this without some version of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's just no way, right? There's no way that we don't come out of this, damaged in some way. But what I think about these the tactics that we see with the Republicans in Texas and in other states is they are sort of like calling, what they are doing is, for a lot of Texans, they think that their government, while it may not be the best, that we think that our leaders are governing in good faith. That if we're restricting care, well, there's got to be some reason, right? There has to be some reason that is worthwhile. And so I think a lot of folks sort of, who aren't involved in this just sort of say, well, okay, well, yeah, it's probably a political stunt. I mean, we live in a modern society, so the courts will stop that, right? And the answer is maybe and maybe not, but they don't stop the sort of the harm that we're already seeing. But I think there is this feeling that we as a population want to do is we want to hold on to this naivete that our government, while it doesn't function great, that it can function, and that no one would just specifically target one particular population and harm them for the sole reason of holding on to power. And I think I think the unbelievable cruelty of this is one of the reasons why folks look away, because it's hard to look and say, whoa, that guy that I voted for, is causing harm to these children, is going to strip them from their homes. Like, am I complicit in that? Surely not. So I think there is a lot of just like struggle for anyone who even pays attention to realize, I mean, even with folks who know me dearly, they've seen me at rallies and they see me, telling them in person, they have a really hard time even grasping the horror of what's going on, even just telling them, because it's so bad that folks don't even want to look at it. So I think that is something that is being weaponized by the Republicans, is this idea that they're doing something so terrible that folks almost don't believe it could actually be happening, but it is.
Yeah, and I think that there's a kind of another piece of that, which you set me up for really well, to kind of pose this as, we see the threat that they are posing to children. We see the threat that these policies, even when they're completely outside of the law, are posing to trans kids in the state. And yet they are being offered in this language of like child protection, weaponizing child protective services in these specific ways. But I feel like that Texas was really, the Texas GOP and the national groups that are influencing what we're seeing in Texas, like Alliance Defending Freedom and others, had a real success in Texas in sort of associating people who are affirming of trans kids and teens with causing harm to children. And I'm wondering if, just sort of like flipping that for a moment, can we talk about like, what was the situation for trans kids in Texas that is actually real, like the actual real challenges and the actual real harms the trans kids in Texas are facing? Because, I was really touched to hear from people talking about building really supportive communities, even in parts of the state that folks might not think were very supportive. The number of parents who come out and are organized now. And I forget who said this earlier, but, this idea, maybe it was you, Rachel, that like you had done all this affirmative work to sort of build this. And now not only has this torn it down, but it's also made it, now you have this other sort of political problem to deal with before you can get back to the realities of caring for kids and doing what's best for them. And I can put that in a question, because sorry, I lost the question in the midst of that. I'm just want to hear you guys talk, but what is this taking attention away from? Like, what is this sort of diverting focus away from that would actually be needed?
I was gonna put this in Rachel's like loving and incredibly capable hands, to just give us sort of like, what she is seeing. I mean, I think some of this is just like, God, it's just children's stuff. Being a kid is just, they already have the stuff of being a kid. STAR tests, those are the tests that the government, Texas gives the kids. I mean, those are happening sort of as we speak. And then, you got to find therapists and caregivers and, all that.
I mean, being a parent in a pandemic is no joke to begin with. And adding all of these layers, parents are really scared for so many reasons right now, but especially parents of trans kids. And I mean, we're seeing parents, the thing is, being a parent of a trans kid doesn't make you know about trans advocacy or what it means to be transgender or any of the intersectional issues that are directly related to and impacted by this legislation and the rhetoric and all the other things around it. So, you know, I see a lot of parents who are new to this journey, supporting their kids, and they're kind of hitting pause and just saying, oh my God, am I going to get my kid taken away from me if I affirm them? Like, maybe I just need to not affirm them now. No, don't let them have medical care if my kid's going to get taken away from me, because I mean, it's a lose-lose situation. And we are seeing parents with exponential privilege in the state with the ability to leave. And I've been asked over and over and over if we're leaving Texas. And I mean, it's always a resounding no, because this is our home. This is our community. This is where our family is. This is where my children have grown up. And we have an affirming community. The things that we face on the daily are not at all related to what we deal with in the Texas legislature. We don't have this kind of discrimination. We're surrounded by people who love and affirm my children, my family. And it's so much, and families are tired, and that's been identified. I mean, that parents are a really effective messenger, because, you know, anybody can have a trans kid. You have no idea when your kid is born if your kid's going to be trans or not. And so we've been a really effective messenger in the Texas legislature and around the country in speaking to what this can look like, what the process is, coming to terms with it, learning how to support the trans community and your own child, and learning the history, learning all, I mean, there are so many different things that all play into this. And so we've been targeted for a reason. And I think that, you know, I know that this really plays into this bigger picture where Texas Leg is going after kids in so many different levels. I mean, look at the CRT ban and the ridiculous mask mandate things and the vaccines and obviously SB8, the abortion ban. There are so many different ways in which kids are being hurt by our legislature, not just with this. And that's obviously very strategic.
I think also, just to sort of expand on it and open it up to folks who don't have trans kids, it seems like they've also been successful, not just in associating, you know, affirming parents with abuse, but also associating adult trans folks with abuse and making it seem suspect somehow if you stand with trans kids. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that and sort of what, you know, to me, what it looks like is there's so much expertise and knowledge in the trans community, and this could potentially be a way to sort of make it harder to bring those two things together. You know, like I mean, I don't see them being effective at keeping trans adults out of this fight, but I do feel like this was an interesting way to frame it, to sort of like draw that line, to say like, well, we're not talking about you, we're just talking about the children. And if you intervene, then you're somehow don't care about the children or even a threat to children.
This is such an interesting prompt, and I could say so much. I think it's nothing new, right? To be attacked as an LGBTQ person as potentially being harmful to children or someone that should not be around because of the influence that you could impose. Granted, it was also something that I was accused of when I was a trans teenager that came out in school, is that me being openly and visibly trans would cause other kids to become openly and visibly trans as well, right? Being queer has always been treated as some sort of contagious disease. And so we cannot have books about it. We cannot have queer adults around our children, because otherwise it will make them gay too. That is not how it works. I think we should all be well past the point of using that excuse and be able to acknowledge that that's not how it works at all. I came out at the age of 17, and I think 7 years later, my brother came out as gay as well. And he had known all along, but he just didn't feel safe and comfortable to come out in a heavily Mexican, heavily Catholic family. And I just could not fathom existing any other way. And so I did. I think that what is happening right now is not a distraction necessarily. I think it's a distraction from their failure in leadership, if anything, right? From Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton. It's a distraction from the very real issues that the Department of Family Protective Services is facing right now. And it is being used as a wedge issue for Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis to continue to gain that national media landscape and attention that can potentially help them run for president. And it is absolutely vile and disgusting, right? And that we are not, as a society, I think, acknowledging that and putting a stop to it. But it is heavily ingrained. And I think that what is an unfortunate reality is I do think trans people are magic. And I think that trans kids and adults of all ages are here, hopefully, on this planet to show people a different way of being and to inspire other folks to know that what we have actually been indoctrinated into is not the only way to be, and there's room for all of us here. And I hope that we continue to use this as an opportunity to share our stories, because things have gotten better in some ways in the last 10 years, even though right now we are under immense political pressure. There's an increased visibility of transgender people. I am on a panel right now with a wonderful transgender woman that serves as an inspiration to me every day. And 10 years ago when I came out, 12 years ago when I came out, I would have never known that to be possible. And so I am forever here to be a beacon of hope, but we need to keep pushing forward and insisting that we are here, we have always been here, and we deserve to be here. And this is just as much our moment to assert that as it is their moment to try to take us down.
Are you waiting for me to say words? I mean, I think so. I feel like I just want to keep telling everybody in the world, it's like, yeah, this feels bad, right? It feels bad. It's, you know, this onslaught of efforts from the Republican leadership is both sloppy and tactical. So the deal is like, this is all message tested, like they worked and they found a population that this would work on, that it would turn out the Republicans and not turn out the Democrats. It was a relatively unknown population, and they're able to cause, you know, targeted tactical harm to consolidate power, right? We can't say that enough. And at the same time, it's sloppy. It's really, really sloppy. I mean, you can watch any of the legislative debates and you can say, holy, this is sloppy, right? Their experts aren't real experts. You know, their arguments are paper thin. And it's really just this, the power is just this sort of like onslaught of volume, which is we're going to bring so much, so often, that it becomes sort of untenable, uncomfortable to be a transgender Texan, right? That the costs get more and more and more. So what does it look like to show up for these kids now? Well, the risk is higher, right? The risk is higher, and it will only become higher as these folks continue to ratchet up the rhetoric. And you know, they're not going to stop us because you can't stop this. You know, we have always been, we will always continue to be. And the only contagion, you know, that is the transgender experience is that we invite those around us to live into who they are. It's quite a contagion. It's authenticity. And it's something that I think people that are inauthentic, like our Republican leaders, are terrified of. Because when someone who is authentic, true down to their core stands up in front of you, you see how far you've strayed, and you can't stand to see your own sight because you're so convicted at how wrong you really are. And I think that's the power of the transgender community. I think that's what we do. So we'll continue to stand up for these children. We'll continue to stand up for ourselves. We'll continue to shine and work. and make Texas a delightful place for us to live. But the costs are real. They're very, very real. I'm not sure that answered your question, but I think it sounded
does.
okay.
Well, it does. And you took us to a kind of church, so thank you. Like I think that's part of it. Like this, it's sloppy and tactical at the same time. When this rhetoric is challenged, which is, not based in evidence or experience or anything like actual compassion towards a constituency, it sort of disintegrates, and yet it doesn't stop it, right? Like I would watch these debates in the hearings where it was almost like even the Republicans could not even hear or accept the existence of trans people, that these conversations were just happening past each other. And it makes it very challenging to fight. And Rachel, you mentioned this, and I think Remington, you've mentioned it as well. Like the people who ostensibly should show up and fight, should show up as allies, on the left, the Democratic Party, liberals and progressives, however you want to call it, people who historically, by the way, like have not shown up for trans rights. It's just we're in this moment where like the Republicans are cannily taking advantage of that history and that lack of support. And one of the ways I think that this is playing out, that we saw in Texas and now is sort of taken over the entire Republican political discourse, is this groomer language, where, Remington, you were talking about like this tendency to look away because it's too horrific. I think that part of what is going on with this groomer language is it just seems so ridiculous and also really uncomfortable, that it is easier for people who don't feel personally impacted by it, who just think it's political theater, to turn away from it and not actually confront it, to just be like, well, this is just like political theater that doesn't merit a response. And you see when you try to respond to it, people are talking past each other, but it still needs to be responded to. I think Jamal Bowie wrote something in the Times this week, if you don't fight the culture war, the only option is to lose. There is something very lacking right now in the response to this. And it's a conversation I've had with a lot of people, and I would love to throw this to the three of you. The ostensible allies, where are they? What are they missing? What is needed?
Okay. So I'm going to solve this for us right here, right now. We're going to set the bar high. Here's how we fix this. The deal is like, I do not want to shame anybody who hasn't shown up yet. Life is really hard. Life is really hard for everybody. So if you haven't been paying attention for whatever reason, fine. Like there is no criticism. There is no shaming of you living your life and caring for yourself and those you love, right? We do what we have to do. And particularly in Texas, where we have an economy that's not working for Texans, right? We have people that are, struggling just to make their own ends meet. So it's, it's not unusual that we can't all go to the Capitol and make our voices heard, right? There's real cost to this. There's real privilege to be able to do this. What I think we need folks to understand is that we do need everyone to have some skin in the game here. That it may look like this only impacts a very specific population, and that who knows, will the courts save us? I don't think they will. We will save ourselves. But that we must sway public opinion. We have to win in the public squares, or we will be pushed into the sidelines where it is much harder to survive. And so I think we need folks to say, look, we're going to be standing, all three of us here, we're going to be in that public square. We're going to show up over and over and over again. And what we need to know is that the community of Texans and across the nation are going to come out with us. And it's going to be messy work, which means, you're never certain where the right path is, but we need folks to start having conversations with their loved ones, with the people at work, when it comes up at the water cooler, on the Zoom meeting, when something comes across their social media feed. We need little tiny steps of people to say, hey, that's not okay. That's not okay. What would it be like if Governor Abbott came into your house when you were trying to care for your children, what would that feel like to you? What would it be like to go see your doctor? And who stands between you and your doctor but Governor Abbott? What would that feel like? And that's something that I want folks to use their empathy to think about and then make tiny little steps. And then when it comes to voting, we need folks to vote. They got to show up, they got to get registered, and we got to vote for people who know how to lead and not terrorize.
No, I mean, I think you about covered it. That's the same thing I always say, is we need people to have those difficult conversations with the people around them and to have faith that they have the capacity to be transformed in some way when they start those conversations. And understanding also an empathy that it takes a long time to combat misinformation once it has taken root in somebody's head. And it is a process that starts with one small conversation. It can eventually build, hopefully, into a moment of taking action for the LGBTQ community and for trans people specifically in this moment.
Rachel, are you going to jump in, or you don't have to, but I'll give you the chance.
I've had so many thoughts, but I didn't write them down, and now I don't remember them. But I do think, obviously, we're dealing with this gap of knowledge, and I think one of the things I come across is people just don't know what to say. Like, people that have that personal touch, that know my family, that know trans individuals, and know trans kids, trans adults, they know that what they're hearing is wrong, but they don't know enough to know what to combat it with. And so I find that people, I mean, I tell so many of my friends, if you don't know what to say, just say, I know that's wrong and that's not true, and just leave it at that. But it is something that I think one of the things I came across a lot last year is talking to friends here who are like, why isn't this in the news? If I didn't know you, I wouldn't know that any of these things are going on. And I mean, I was explicitly told by a national news outlet after we spent an entire day doing an interview that there wasn't an appetite for it after all, so they didn't air it. They ended up airing it a while later, but it was, I mean, it's pretty hard to tell my kid, oh, it's not airing because your safety isn't trending. But there really isn't. Oh, sorry. There really isn't enough out there really for people to be, and I think people are burnt out on news. A lot of people are, they just don't even read the news anymore because it's so bad that, much to what we've already discussed, there's just too much out there that is bad, that people just tune out, and we need people to pay attention. I'm gonna mute myself so you don't have to listen to the dogs.
Your dogs are great. Don't apologize for the dogs.
Can I jump in super quick? Just super duper quick. I just want to give like a little chaser to what Rachel said, which is chaser. Is that the thing that comes after? Yes, a little chaser to like, yes, we want to tie this up really tidy, which is folks are always wondering, well, I can't say something if I can't win, right? If I don't know all the things, I don't want to get lost in it. We're not asking you guys to be experts on the care and support of transgender children. We're not asking you to be experts in how the government works or directives works or CPS works. We're simply asking you to say, what we see is wrong, and we believe these children should be safe and cared for, right? That's it. Like, that's a thing we all know deep in our cores, is these children should be safe and cared for. They should be with their families. They should be able to meet with their doctors and their caregivers, and they shouldn't be afraid of teachers and nurses and therapists. We know these things. So these are things that we can say, and we don't have to have the right turn, the right phrase, the right sort of argument structure to get there. It's just a matter of saying, this is right, this is wrong. Terrorizing families is wrong. Protecting families is right. That's all that we need the population of this country to know, and we need them to do it with us.
I feel like I don't have to say anything else, but I'm going to say one quick thing so that anybody who has a question has a second to drop it into the chat box, which is maybe, and I'm not an optimist, if you didn't already gather that, folks listening, but I agree that the courts are not going to save us. That this is about finding ways in a decaying democracy, to be perfectly honest, in a fraying legal system, to survive. I mean, that is the stakes of this right now, and that is a fight that many, many people have found themselves in this moment. And I do wonder if part of the reason this was so successful, part of the reason things like states where bathroom bans never happened, states that fought back against sports bans for years, and then all of a sudden they passed this year. As you were saying, Rachel, like it's a really hard time to be a parent right now. It's a really hard time to be a person right now. People are burnt out on the news. And I think there is something about this particular environment that was very fertile ground for this campaign to really like grow and grow and grow at speeds that nobody was prepared for and prepared to fight. And I think what we see in Texas is what the fight back also can look like. And I hope that folks in other states can learn from what you're doing and also support what you're doing, because it is by no means over. The next legislative session starts in I don't know how many months. So yeah, it is far from over. Adri, do you want to say something?
I think that we talk a lot, right, especially in Texas in this moment, about democracy that is dying and democracy that is failing us. And as somebody who's a first generation immigrant, who this democracy never worked for me or my family, if I'm being quite honest, especially not as a trans person, this is a system that has not worked for a lot of people in this country, right? And so what I see right now in this moment is an opportunity, one, to shine light to that, to I think erase the ways that the conservative right is trying to divide us along these lines, and to highlight that as a society we can build whatever we want out of this democracy, right? And if we are currently encouraging as a group, a society and a government that chooses to bully the most vulnerable amongst us, is that really a part of the government that you want to be a part of? Is that the part of the world that you want to create? And I think that we can have those conversations very easily with folks in this way, using that prompt, using some of the prompts that Remington mentioned to make people feel, to tell stories full of facts, to make people feel what this feels like, and to hopefully connect on a human level. But I think that was an interesting thing that just sparked something in me that I felt the need to share. So thank you for the space.
Yeah, I think that's really key, is that this hasn't been a democracy for many people for a long time also. There's a lot of really great questions in the chat. There's no way I'm going to be able to get to all of them. I really appreciate this one, and there's some folks who've been asking a variation of it. So this comes from Jean Woodbury at Equality Arizona. Hi, Jean. Why do you think some of the appeals to empathy we've tried in the past are proving less effective this year? It's been something I've noticed in Arizona, and it's required some major shifts in approach. Does anyone have thoughts?
The pandemic. So the pandemic was a psychic sledgehammer for everyone. 4 years of Trump, a pandemic. Our faith and trust in our fellow human beings is pretty frazzled and frayed, and our ability to function as our own selves is in disarray. So I think these appeals to empathy are struggling to gain ground, because I think we have watched our government turn its back as a pandemic ravaged us, right? As we saw our nurses, begging our governments, our state legislatures to make policies so that their ICUs wouldn't be overrun with people who were dying. I come from the healthcare world. I recently consulted with a clinic that sees folks with long COVID, and it is this psychic sledgehammer of pandemic that just fried everybody. And these patients are suffering from long COVID, which is something we know exists, and yet even when they appeal with empathy, they are being not heard and cared for and listened to, even by their closest loved ones. So I think we're not alone in appeals to empathy not working. We're not working as they used to, and I think this is where the persistence and the tenacity and the cleverness of what we have to do lays itself bare, which is, we got to keep knocking on that door. We got to keep packaging this and framing it and meeting folks where they are so that they can join us. I mean, arms wide open. we're here to wrap you all up and do the good work together.
I think that this is an area where appeals to empathy actually work really well when we highlight the mental health impacts on the transgender community when discussing restrictions on being able to access this life-saving medical care. When it comes to transgender athletes participating in sports, regardless of the age, appeals to empathy tend to work less, if at all. Because in one versus the other, we have been, when it comes to trans sports, I think that the right has been able to paint this picture of a mythic Frankenstein-esque transgender person who is 7 feet tall and gonna dunk on you like Shaq, no matter what the sport is. And they've been more successful at painting that false caricature of transgender people, I think, that people can immediately latch onto as being something that might harm them. But when it comes to these like bans on gender affirming care, appeals to empathy when being able to highlight the mental health impacts and the negative mental health impacts that this has on transgender people, and overall the negative impacts that it has societally for transgender people, we have found that that does work a little bit. Doesn't really get us over the line yet, but it does get people from a lower end to a more medium point.
So are you saying we just need to keep, I mean, you get
keep
like
on trucking? Yeah,
do the fundamentals. We keep working it, you keep working it, and eventually it's going to work. I mean, that sounds good to me. Fundamentals,
like a broken record. Yeah.
I guess it's also kind of, who is empathy going to work on? You know, there are some people where empathy is the unreachable, but there are plenty of people who are disengaged. There's a lot of questions in the chat from folks who are like, I want to do something. What are like the 1 or 2 things I can do? I don't know that we can answer that in the 5 minutes that we have, but if anybody wants to take a stab at that, or you can literally just say, please follow me on Twitter and I'll tell you there. And we can move to another question, because that's a very hard question to answer, but I want to give you the chance to, if you think you can in the space we have.
I mean, in the space we have, I think if you send me an individual message, tell me what situation you're in and what you need to know, I will take the time to respond to you and have a meeting with you. So there is that. My Twitter DMs are open all day, every day.
I'm going to keep going. Sorry, Remington, do you want to say
I was
something?
just going to say, personally, I mean, this is where, like, when you see a trans person, kind of just be nice to him. That's pretty good thing. I mean, this stuff matters, right? It matters. Not to look at them with pity, right? Because there's nothing really to pity about us. But to just offer us genuine care and kindness, what you would do with other folks, but just to be intentional about it. I also like pie. So if folks run into me in the world, I'd love some pie and a hug. And that will help us keep going that, and vote. Please vote.
This is a question that I think has been alluded to, but I just want to give you a chance if anyone wants to dig into it in specific. There's, you know, the GOP in Texas has tried this kind of extra legal strategy out before on abortion. It has successfully, with SB 8, sort of adopted this vigilantism strategy, you know, to get around Roe v. Wade, which might not matter so much in a couple of months. But that said, this is not, these strategies that are being used against the trans community have been used in other communities. And someone was asking, you know, can you say a little bit about that connection around reproductive justice and just like LGBTQI rights generally, and just where do you see those connections? Where do you see maybe even some possibility in terms of working cross issues?
I could talk about this for a full hour if given the opportunity. I mean, obviously the two are linked because of bodily autonomy, and they're linked because of the two issues that are most under attack at the Texas legislature specifically, and across the country right now in this moment. And so there's a real light being shined on them. If we take a look at repro rights in Texas 10 years ago, that's when the bans first started that shuttered half of the abortion clinics in the state. And the care across the state never recovered from that attack. And that is a data point that is very salient in my mind as I see these attacks on gender affirming care and what that could mean 10 years down the line for long-term care for transgender people. However, in one case more than the other, it's easier to make the case of discrimination. that is explicitly targeted against one group of people. And I know that the courts will not save us, and I don't ever believe that. Even though I work for the ACLU, transgender people will save ourselves, and we will take care of each other to the very end if it comes to that, because we always have. And that is what I have known in my life as a transgender person, is that trans women will always have my back to get me the care that I need, and they always have. But in one case more than the other, there I think is a clear case to be made for discrimination. And you can make the case when it comes to abortion access as well, but that one is harder to believe because as a society, we tend to really look down on poor people and on marginalized people of color. This affects people across class and across race, and it affects families, both Republican and Democratic alike. And I think that there's something to be built there, and I don't quite yet know what it is.
Something kind of between reproductive justice and trans rights and justice, which I'll say are arbitrary distinctions because a lot of the same people are working on the same things, yourself included. I mean, so these may be siloed in sort of a political imaginary, but in real life, the people who are doing the work are often the same people. Yeah, I could talk about this forever too. Maybe we should do a whole other thing on this, actually. Thank you for the question, Frederick. I just want to give us one last one. You know, there's a lot of questions about red states in the South and why is this happening in the South? And I feel like we heard this a lot around abortion too, right? Well, we just have to get everybody out of red states if they want to have access to abortion. And I just kind of want to throw this to you to ground us back in Texas for a moment. I don't think this is necessarily about red states. I don't think this is necessarily about Texas. Clearly, not everyone in Texas supports this. I think this is not indicative of who is in the state. It is indicative of the power structures in the state. But that being said, you know, why is, I don't know, I guess I could ask you this. Is this a red state thing? Is this a Texas thing? Clearly, I don't think that it is, but I would love to hear what you guys think.
I would love to answer that. It's something that I talk about all the time. I know families all over the country who have trans kids, and I know families all over the country who have problems in schools, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, far more than I have here, many of them in blue states. This is not a red state problem. What I have seen over and over from friends in blue states is, and this is not across the board, but it's something that surprises people often. Something that I experience in my community in Dallas is this urgent need to be able to support trans kids because of what's going on in the Texas legislature. Teachers, school administrators, coaches, neighbors, friends, people are wanting to do what's right because this is an urgent need. I have friends on the West Coast in other places that have terrible bullying from teachers, in the Northeast, from other classmates, from neighbors, and there isn't the same kind of urgent need. You see this kind of blasé approach because they think since they're in a blue state, it's all going to be fine, and people are not working to unpack their own gender bias, to figure out how they can show up and support trans kids, especially in schools. And so I think, I also am not always an optimist, and I have been constantly, for years, been telling my husband, if we have to leave Texas, we have to leave the country, because I don't know where we would go if, people that are in blue states, I think, are foolish to think that this won't reach them. If this keeps spreading and they don't help us shut this down, it's going to hit their states. I've helped people with their testimonies in Maryland against the sports ban hearing. People, I'm not sure, even realize that that's happening. So anyway, it's one of my hot topics I like to talk about often because people are constantly asking me when I'm leaving Texas, and I get real annoyed.
Republicans, regardless of the greater power structure in a state, are filing these bills all over the country as a way to score political points with their donors that are fueling these fights, to say that they will do it, that they would do it, that if they ever run for higher office, this is the agenda that they would promote. So regardless if it's a Republican in a red state or a blue state, it crosses those political divides. Just wanted to add that last.
No, thanks.
But I am an optimist.
Remington, Yeah. Some days. Remington, do you want to take us out?
Let's take us out. So I'm an optimist. But I'm not a Pollyanna, right? I like I said, we're going to get out of this, right? We're going to make it, but there's very real costs, right? There will be children who harm themselves because of the rhetoric of these politicians. There will be children that are harmed for an entire life. We know that adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs studies, what we know is like, these are huge indicators of lifelong chronic conditions because they were not supported safely as children. Right? We know there will be harm. And also, I believe that there's something really special about what we are doing. You know, we say, you know, there's with greater visibility, you know, has our visibility caused this, right? The transgender tipping point, and now we get all this attention? And the answer is no. You know, a lot of these Republican leaders, you know, Jesus. All right, let me dial it in here. Here's the thing. We need everybody to care. Everybody to care, because it's about power and control. With the reproductive rights, it's power and control. With transgender children, it's power and control. It is power and control. And we all have to realize that it is power and control that these folks want. And if we don't stand up for the least of us, they will eventually come for all of us. Amen? Amen.
With that amazing panel, thank you so much for sharing everything that you did and giving us your time and taking us through some truly challenging things, and also maybe a little bit of optimism. I'll give that on our way out. Thank you everyone for joining us as well. And yeah, if you have other questions, feel free to hit me up as well. mggrant@tnr.com. I would love to help if I can direct you to other experts as well. And Adri's DMs are open. And Rachel and Remington are also great follows on Twitter just to stay on top of what's going on. So thank you all, everyone. Have a good night.